Environmental groups, including Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion, have staged various demonstrations in recent months, causing a disruption to commuters and in traffic in central London.
Wildfires and severe drought. We cannot afford new oil and gas. It is going to take everything we know and love.
Just in the last couple of days, 2 Just Stop Oil protesters threw tomato soup at Van Gogh's Sunflowers in the National Gallery. Of course, the painting is protected by a glass panel, so it wasn't damaged. Yesterday, Animal Rebellion protesters poured milk on the floor in shops across the country, including Harrods and Fortnum and Mason's. I'm joined now by Adam Wagner, who's a human rights barrister and the author of a new book called Emergency State: How We Lost Our Freedoms in the Pandemic and Why It Matters. Adam, thanks for giving us your time.
Good afternoon.
Adam, I've been seeing your tweets this morning after this news has come out. Tell us, what are your thoughts on the Home Secretary's comments and what she plans to do?
I think it's really important to make sure we don't oversteer with solutions to the issues that you've just raised. So, of the protest that you mentioned, the throwing the soup at the Van Gogh painting, spilling milk in a supermarket on purpose, those would all be probably against the criminal law already because they're criminal damage. And none of these provisions, which are going to be brought in potentially this week or begin to be brought in through the public order bill, would deal with any of that, would make it any more difficult to do that. What they would do is place very, very swinging restrictions on mass protest movements, which, generally speaking, as long as they're non-violent, and violence is always against the law, as long as they're non-violent, we've tolerated them in this country. So I think it's very worrying.
What is the Home Secretary actually suggesting? She has come forward to say that she's going to give Secretaries of State the power to basically say what is allowed and what is not allowed. Can you extrapolate a little bit of what she's putting forward?
Yeah, so there's lots in this bill. Most of it has already been attempted to through the Policing Act, which came in earlier this year, but was kicked out by the House of Lords. So the government's trying again with things like criminalising tunnelling, locking on offences involving infrastructure, powers to stop and search at protests, putting protest banning orders on people. So preventing them from protesting completely if they're considered to be disruptive people who have committed offences before. All of that's been was in the previous bill. The new bit of this is allowing the Secretary of State, the Home Secretary, to go to a court and get an injunction preventing protests that is likely to cause serious disruption to national infrastructure, or where the Secretary of State reasonably believes the activities will have a serious adverse effect on public safety or prevent access to essential goods or essential services. So very, very wide. And what that means is that once there's an injunction in place, if someone breaches the injunction, they have breached the court order, they can be held in contempt of court and they can go to prison for up to 2 years.
And is the concern here, Adam, that this is going to be very much left down to politicians to decide whether they like the protest, whether they disagree with the protest? And of course, we're not just looking at this government, we're looking at successive governments. People generally, as you made clear in your social media posts today, people generally object to protests that they don't agree with, but are happy to look at the other way if it's a protest that they're fully behind.
Exactly. You've always got to do the thought experiment, not about the one you don't agree with, but with the one you do agree with. Think of the cause you care about, and how would you feel if the police and the Home Secretary were effectively preventing it happening? And I think that the more laws we have, don't forget we already have a whole bevy of laws to prevent serious disruption through protest, also any kind of violence or criminal damage or blocking of the highways, all illegal under the criminal law. So what this does is it brings police and politicians far more heavily into deciding whether protests can go ahead or not. And if they do go ahead, to what extent individuals who took part in them should be found and should be charged with a criminal offence. And that's really very serious, because ultimately protest is a safety valve in democracies. It's to ensure that people can go out and express themselves about something they care deeply about, We've always had, all big protests are disruptive, as are all football matches. The coronation will be highly disruptive. Any sort of public festival is disruptive. But it seems here that over in these provisions, and also over the last few years, we're getting to a point where we've decided that disruption should be something which is outlawed, which will effectively prevent protests, and that is very concerning.
I want to come on to your book at the moment, because I feel that it couldn't have come at a better time. But just before we move on from this, because a lot of what is written in the papers today references, for example, ambulances not being able to get to where they're needed because there's a protest in the street, fire brigades not being able to go to emergencies, again, because roads have been blocked. But from what I understand, from what you're telling us now, these things, blocking highways is already illegal. There's already laws there to prevent you from doing it. Have I understood that correctly?
Obstruction of the highway is a criminal offence. There is a potential defence if you are exercising your free speech rights, but it's already a criminal offence. Now, if we look at Insulate Britain, which I think was one of the triggers for the original version of this, their entire purpose was to block the highway. And the courts have taken a very dim view of that when there were injunctions taken out through the entire national road network. And the court have sent people to prison for doing that, because the courts have effectively said that's the balance between, some necessary disruption from a public protest and this, which is all about the disruption, tips in favour of sending people to prison. Now, people may or may not agree with that, but why all these new laws will do is create more and more situations where the police are having to decide which protests can go ahead and which can't. And the Home Secretary, who is not an independent or neutral arbiter of these things, the Home Secretary will often be the target of the protests. For example, the people who blocked vans taking asylum seekers to be deported. Those sorts of, or I think probably failed asylum seekers being taken to be deported. The Home Secretary will sometimes be the target of these things. So I think the more we keep politicians and police out of these peaceful protests, the better.
Adam, tell me about your book, Emergency State, How We Lost Our Freedoms in the Pandemic and Why It Matters. It's just been released. Tell us a little bit about it.
So the book's about what happened to freedom during the pandemic. It's really looking at how we got to a stage where the government, really just through a few ministers, were imposing criminal laws on almost a daily basis, which restricted freedoms like never before in the UK, albeit with an important cause, which was to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And I think where I look a lot at what happened to protests during the pandemic, where we, for the first time maybe in our history, there were criminal laws which prevented or seemed to prevent protest entirely. So you couldn't go out during the lockdowns and protest under the criminal laws. And the police, most famously with the Sarah Everard vigil, found themselves in some very hot water because of the way they enforced those laws. The government, I think, dropped the ball, didn't take responsibility for what they were doing. And we saw, I think, a real crackdown and a restriction on the fundamental right to disagree with and express your disagreement with government policy at a time where the government policies were extremely controversial and unprecedented. So I think, in a way, that should be a warning sign of not doing what the Home Secretary is trying to do now, which is to effectively put some of that on a permanent basis rather than emergency lawmaking basis.